Is 108 megapixels really that much better than 48? Well, that's what I thought, at least in terms of detail, but I went out and I took a ton of photos, both compressed files, raw files, and expert raw, and the results were kind of crazy. Let's jump right in here with standard compressed photos. The Samsung has more contrast and saturation and might look a little bit more detailed, but when we punch in, the iPhone actually looks a little bit more detailed. The Samsung looks a little bit over-processed in the trees there, where the iPhone looks more natural. And by the way, these photos have not been edited at all. I'll let you know when we get to that portion. In this shot, obviously we have some white balance differences, but focusing on the detail, it's hard to tell. But when we look closer, you don't see more detail in the Samsung, even though it has more than twice the resolution. By the way, I made sure both of these are updated to the latest software for this comparison. In this photo, I'm surprised that the iPhone has more contrast than the Samsung. Samsung's more saturated. Taking a closer look, my son does look more detailed on the Samsung, whereas the iPhone has more detail with those shrubs. We have a lot more going on with this image. The first thing that pops out to me is the sky. The Samsung, it looks like some of it's clipping, so the dynamic range isn't as good. And yes, it's a lot harder to do HDR on 108 megapixels compared to 48, and the iPhone has that A16. And when we look closer, we have more noise on the Samsung, and that car looks a lot more flat. And then that shrub right there, crazy amount of detail on the iPhone. Now, another thing I noticed is that with the Samsung in 108 megapixel mode, you just don't have the HDR, and even some of the lens distortion that goes away in 12 megapixel, you don't have, so the iPhone looks a lot better. Once again, I have not edited these, and if anything else sticks out to you, comment down below. Now, this is a very difficult image. We have that grass that's popping from the sun, all those shadows, and when I look closer, I was shocked to see all the artifacts on the Samsung compared to the iPhone retaining all that detail. I had to research this, and I'll explain why this is happening later in the video. I wanted to take a shot without difficult lighting, so here's one in our studio. Both of these are unprocessed. I just converted the RAW to a JPEG, and when we take a look closer, it is absolutely insane, the difference in detail. The iPhone is tack sharp. Now in this image, I could tell that the iPhone has more detail with that better dynamic range. Looking closer, the oversaturation of those leaves there makes it look like it's kind of blending together, whereas the iPhone looks realistic, almost like it's from a DSLR. And I'm not trying to sabotage the Samsung, I just think it's too much processing with 108 megapixels to make this all happen and fast enough, which is why I also tested out RAW. But first, check out these cases from our sponsor Mkiki, who have been making affordable cases since 2015 with over 100,000 positive reviews. They have clear cases for the whole iPhone 14 lineup, and not only do they have standard, but these cool gradient versions that get darker on the sides towards the bottom. They are slim while having 6D protection with upgraded airbag bumpers for military-grade shock protection, as well as a 1.9mm raised lip to protect your screen and a 3.5mm raised bezel on the back to protect your cameras, while being wear and scratch resistant, anti-yellowing, and comfortable in the hand. Check them out and get an additional 15% off Mkiki's already super low prices on either the fully clear, gradient, or their other color cases by using the special links in the video description below. Here is a raw shot. Look how much more natural the trees look now. Now, of course, it's not processed, so you see the dynamic range. And in this one, both are Samsung shots, but I pushed the raw just a bit. And even though it's saturated, we don't have all the highlights in the tree kind of mushing together. And this is the last JPEG comparison. It's a very tough shot with bright highlights in the background and shadows, and punching in, this is just crazy. Now, obviously, you see the difference in dynamic range. The trees at the top are blown out, as are the rocks. But what's interesting to me is that the rocks are all warmer, but then in the shade, it is cooler. And now it is time to get into the raw shots, starting out with their Pro application. Now, right out of the gate, I found that the Samsung overexposes the image if you're using auto exposure, so I switched to manual, and I tried to find the best balance of exposure. After that, I went into Lightroom and I started playing with the image to get the most of it while keeping it looking natural. And here is the difference from the raw shot. As you guys could see, it looks a lot better and more natural. The iPhone, by the way, is still unprocessed. And taking a closer look here, the tree at the top looks much more natural compared to the previous shot where it was all crunchy and overexposed. Here's a direct comparison between the Samsung RAW and the JPEG. Looks much more natural, but the iPhone still looks better in terms of detail and dynamic range. So with that said, let's go ahead and compare the dynamic range with the RAW from both of these. Here's the first shot, and you can see that the Samsung's single RAW file exposed for the shadows blows out the sky. I went ahead and I adjusted that as much as I could, and while the shadows look great, I could not pull back all the highlights from the sky. And here we have a very tough situation. So this is just neutrally exposed. You see the highlights are blown out, the shadows are too dark. So I took a shot exposing for the shadows. I want to see how much I can pull back in the highlights. And editing it, I could not pull back that sky or the street. So I decided to expose for the highlights, the sky there. And once I did my best editing it, this is what I got. Now the highlights, they don't pop as much as on the iPhone shot that is unedited. And the shadows, they don't look too bad. But punching in, we have a lot of artifacting and noise because we had to push up the shadows too much. So how in the world do the iPhone's RAW shots look so good even though I didn't touch them? Well, when Apple announced Pro RAW, they said that this is the first format that can still make use of stacking multiple images using their deep fusion technology, and that makes for a really good looking image even though it's raw, while at the same time not baking in things like sharpening, white balance, tone mapping, highlights, and all those things that you can still adjust. That makes for a much better looking image with great dynamic range compared to a single raw file. Now, about a year or a little bit more than that after Apple announced Pro RAW, Samsung announced their Expert RAW app that also does a very similar thing. Now this app is not preloaded on the phone, it's not even the Play Store, you have to download it from the Samsung store. And I took a variety of shots to see how good the Samsung can do. Now as you guys can see, the Expert RAW shot still doesn't look as good as Apple's if you don't edit either one of them. So I went into Lightroom and I want to see how much of that sky I can get out, but there wasn't that much information there. So then I went ahead and started making adjustments. I selected the sky separately, and this is the final result, trying to get as much as I could out of that image. Now, the Samsung's does look a little overprocessed. I was just trying to get the same dynamic range. And punching in here, even though the Samsung is stacking photos, we still have a lot of noise and artifacting. Now this shot looks crazy, but the sunset was beautiful and gorgeous, full of colors, and my wife was facing away from it. I did a detailed job editing the sky and Alina separately, and this is how far I was able to push that image. There's just not a lot of highlight recovery that you can do, almost like it's not really a RAW file, kind of like a higher bitrate JPEG. Because of that, I underexposed on the Samsung and my wife was in a darker spot, and then I brought all that up, I adjusted her separately from the sky. I really tried to get as much dynamic range out of sky as I could, and the sky does look good, and she is nice and bright now, but I did push it a bit too far, because if you guys look at the top left corner, we have so much noise and stuff that was crushed. Same thing with the tree in the background. It just doesn't look the same. Now the iPhone shots, I still have not touched. So this time around, I actually did push the iPhone shots more. I was able to recover more highlights from the sky, push her exposure up as well. And here is a close-up of Alina. Now the Samsung looks sharper because the whole image is just filled with artifacts, where on the left-hand side, looks like the iPhone wasn't really shooting 48 megapixels because it was really dark. It chose to bin the image. Now I told you guys about this in my previous video that even if you're shooting Pro RAW, if it gets dark, the iPhone will do a 12 megapixel shot. And I don't know if you guys have noticed it yet, but the Samsung, if you're shooting RAW, even Expert RAW, it does not record 108 megapixels. They are all binned down, so you don't get that super high resolution. Because of that, even in easy lighting, and if you edit the images to look their best, the Samsung still cannot compete in terms of detail. When looking into this, I found a lot of people that complain about this online, that they want the natural colors, be able to process it, but they also want the high resolution, which you can't get unless you shoot the compressed files, which don't have that natural look. And now let's take a look at dark and night shots, and it gets even worse. If you're taking 108 megapixel, you do not get that night mode that looks so great, whereas the iPhone's ProRAW can still do that. Now, I didn't know this at first, and I was taking images here, and it was taking longer exposures, but as you can see, it is so dark on the Samsung. And switching to 108 megapixel JPEGs, well, it seems like it's doing night mode, but the image still looks terrible because it's focusing the processing on all of those megapixels. Dropping down to plain old 12 megapixel compressed files, well, here is a shot with the night mode. It definitely is a lot brighter, looks good, but then in the sky we have all those artifacts, and we're not bringing out the stars because it also does not allow you to do a very long exposure like the iPhone does or a Pixel. Now in the super dark scene, the night mode with ProRAW brought Noah up, whereas the 108 megapixel JPEG mode, it just was too dark. Switching to RAW, it looks better. I wanted to see how much I can push and pull these images to make it look more like the iPhones, but unfortunately it falls apart. There's a lot of artifacting in the face, and a lot of that is just crushed detail there. So I turned on some more lights, and the Expert RAW, it just does not look good. There's weird colors, weird artifacting, whereas Apple's ProRAW looks great. I switched it to plain old regular 12 megapixel shots that are compressed, and it looks a lot better now. So I would say if it's really dark, just use the standard mode, and if it's not too dark, shoot the 108 megapixel so you get that detail. Now here, it looks pretty good, and punching in, the iPhone's 48 megapixels still beats out the 108 megapixels in terms of detail, as well as dynamic range if you look at the lights in the bottom right hand side. And with that, if you're shooting the compressed mode, so that doesn't take forever, you have all the features like night mode and things like that, well, when we bring up both of these images, I edited the ProRAW, you can bring them up, but you have a lot of artifacting and all the shadows, for example, the top, right, and left of the images. And then of course, in your subject as well, and you have worse dynamic range. So it's kind of like you get everything with the iPhone. You have all the features with ProRAW. The images look great, even if you don't touch them and edit them. But the Samsung, you have to choose. Do you want a compressed image that's crunchy and the dynamic range isn't good, and the colors are kind of mushed together, or do you want to have more flexibility but lower resolution and you don't have night mode, takes longer to shoot? It's just kind of crazy. So why in the world is 108 megapixels a lot worse than 48? Well, as I mentioned, 48 is a lot easier to process, but with that, the sensor that is in here hasn't really changed much back from when Samsung first introduced it. Now, the first version sucked with autofocus, and we covered that, but then the updated version, they fixed the autofocus, but since then, the actual performance and the readout of the sensor hasn't really changed. So this is a really old sensor in here that they keep reusing, and that's why when they're using their JPEGs, they can do more processing to it. It doesn't look too bad, still not great, but the actual RAW performance, even with Expert RAW, they cannot just make up for the fact that it's an old sensor. It's a lot more data to process with a weaker processor compared to a sensor that just came out on the iPhone. It's new, it's efficient, and the A16 is very good. You guys let me know down in the comment section what your thoughts are, and if you guys appreciate all the crazy effort that went into this video, it took a long time, please hit that subscribe button above. Check out one of those videos right over there. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next one.